Is France going to send troops into Ukraine to fight Russian troops? Will Vladimir Putin use a tactical nuclear weapon if, especially if NATO forces or American forces in particular, if they enter the fray in any capacity into the Ukraine fight? Is that what we're facing? Are we in a situation now where this war, after having stayed contained within the borders of Ukraine and all these alleged red lines that have been passed have not resulted in the war's expansion, have we now reached the point to where that is all in jeopardy and this war could expand? Those are some very, very serious issues that have dramatic impact on American national security. And we have somebody that's an excellent to discuss this with today. Rebekah Koffler, from former DIA officer, author of Putin's Mind, which is one of the things we're going to try to dig into today, because Putin's Playbook, Russia's secret plan to defeat America. She wrote this, by the way, before the Russia-Ukraine war broke out. So she's been tracking this for a long time. She's actually was born and raised in the Soviet Union. I want to actually talk about that a little bit because that kind of gives you an insight into the culture and the mindset more than just, some American analyst. And of course, you also used to work at the DIA. So, man, there's nobody more qualified to talk about these things today than you are. And welcome back to the show, Rebekah.
Thank you very much, Colonel Davis. It's such a pleasure to be here with you and your audience today.
And listen, we're real eager, but I wonder if you could kind of give us all a flavor for, what your background was and what you observed and how long you lived there before moving to the U.S.
So I was born and raised in the former Soviet Union, and I came to the United States in 1989 before the Soviet Union actually collapsed. And I served in the U.S. intelligence community, specifically the Defense Intelligence Agency. The DIA is a military counterpart to the CIA. We actually do the real work. If I might add, we track foreign adversaries' military capabilities and warfighting doctrine, and we advise our commands and the U.S. president on how they could devise counter strategies to those adversaries. And I personally briefed the Obama administration's White House National Security Council, not just once, but multiple times, warning them about Putin's plans. I briefed NATO. Wow. In September 2013, just in the run-up of Putin's invasion of Crimea. I briefed scores and scores of Pentagon's officials, European Command, Northern Command, Strategic Command that guards our nuclear weapons. And so I've been on this target, Putin that is, and his mindset for years.
And so if you could kind of characterize what, if it's even possible in a short period of time, what is the difference in cultural mindset, especially as it relates to war and peace issues in the Russian mindset as opposed to the Western mindset, since you've now lived in both?
Sure. I would summarize it as like it's three things. First is the Russian culture can be described as a glass half full and or half empty, and the U.S. culture is half full, right? The Russians are prone to a worst case scenario assessment, and that goes back to its history and traditions. The Russian history is just full of wars, right? And they always expect the worst. They've experienced regime change even in the last 100 years about 4 times, right? 1914, 1917, 1941, and 1991. So the second thing is Russia believes that there's really no such thing as peace, that you are in constant war. It's just the war is the intensity varies. It's a constant confrontation, and that comes from the Karl Marx doctrine and the perpetual class struggle between the haves and have-nots. And with respect to the current war, right, between Russia and Ukraine, the Russians believe that Ukraine belongs to Russia. for centuries. And so naturally, most Russians, that is, not everyone, but the majority who support Putin, which was about between 79 and 84%. So they
Mm.
are fully behind them. And that is really the difference when
So when Putin has said that, because he has many times, even some more recently, that lands on fertile ground among his domestic population.
exactly. And so it's, and what Americans kind of believe is that the Russian people are suffering under Putin, but that nothing can be further from the truth. The
Mm.
Russians elect Putin because they actually, again, culturally predisposed to admire a tough leader, even
Yeah.
bordering, on brutal. Remember, it's the Russian culture that produced Joseph Stalin and Ivan the Terrible, who killed his own son. So, and these
Don't
are
I
the basic.
remember about I don't know, 4 or 5 years ago maybe, that there was a big movement in Russia where they were discussing the rehabilitation of the image of Stalin, and suddenly they didn't see him as such a bad guy that even though he killed millions of Russians.
Exactly. That is the epitome of the differences between the Russian culture and the American culture, because and so basically Russia is a vast country, right? It spans 11 time zones. And so to hold all of these people together, the Russians believe one needs a very strong hand. And the further away, they go from Stalin times, the times of the Great Terror, right? When people were just like thrown into gulags, grabs, executed, just on the slightest pretext or suspicion,
Yeah.
rather, of treason. So the further they get away, the more kind of benign Stalin seems to them. And even my own father, right, who's an old in his 80s right now, and he lives in the United States, but he admires Stalin. So
Oh
it just
man.
tells you, like, we cannot have
Yeah.
a conversation, a logical conversation. So that just demonstrates to you the difficulty that the U.S. leadership has in dealing with Russia.
I see. Okay, well, that's going to come into play here in just a second. So let's jump right in now to what's going on here in the last 48 hours or so, because there's been a couple of really big interviews that were on Russian television and then on French television last night, which have kind of ramped up the tensions here. Well, I want to get behind a little bit about what you think is being said here, because there's a number of commentators, especially in the United States, that say that basically Putin's just a blowhard and he just says a bunch of stuff, doesn't mean any of it. And then you have the other side where, interestingly, on Macron's side, where they also say, well, he's just a blowhard. He's not meaning any of this. But the problem is that if either one of them actually mean what they're saying, this could escalate into tactical nuclear explosions pretty quickly. And we're going to touch on that specifically in just a second. But first of all, here's what Macron had to say just last night about why he thinks, or he's claiming anyway, that this is an existential fight for France.
Qu'est-ce qui se joue en Ukraine? Une guerre qui est existentielle pour notre Europe et pour la France. J'espère qu'on y reviendra parce que c'est un sujet clé. Et donc, je décide, parce qu'après 2 ans de guerre, après d'ailleurs, je veux ici le rappeler, que nous ayons systématiquement fait ce que nous disions que nous n'allions pas faire. Ce qui relativise aussi les propos très définitifs tenus parfois par certains à travers l'Europe. Il y a 2 ans, nous disions « jamais on n'enverra de chars ». On l'a fait. Il y a 2 ans, on disait « jamais nous n'enverrons de missiles de moyenne portée ». On l'a fait. Mais on disait « jamais on n'enverra d'avions ». Certains sont en train de le faire. Donc, nous avons mis trop de limites, si je puis dire, dans notre vocabulaire. Nous ne sommes pas dans l'escalade. Nous ne sommes pas en guerre contre la Russie. Simplement, il faut être clair, nous ne devons pas laisser la Russie gagner.
Now, a couple of weeks ago, prompting before Macron made his comments here, Putin was addressing his nation, and he specifically said, nuclear weapons, not off the table.
They're talking about the possibility of sending NATO military contingents to Ukraine. But we remember the fate of those who once sent their contingents to our country. But now, the consequences for possible interventionists will be much more tragic.
We
We also have weapons. They know about this. As I just said, we also have a weapon that can hit targets on their territory.
Придумывают сейчас, чем
And they should understand that what they're doing now, trying to scare the whole world, it does risk a conflict with nuclear weapons, which means the destruction of civilization.
Now, also, actually, even in that clip of Macron I had just a second ago, he implied there and later on did say, hey, we should not self-deter ourselves. We talked about all these categories of weapons that would, be red lines, but we crossed them and nothing happened. We should stop self-deterring ourselves. There should be no red lines. And in direct response to that, Putin said this.
Well, first of all, North Korea, they have a nuclear umbrella of their own. They have not asked us for anything. Secondly, from what we see now, from what's happening on the battlefield, we are doing quite fine with the goals that we have set out for ourselves. As for those states who are saying that they have no red lines in regards of Russia, well, they need to understand that Russia will have no red lines in regards of these countries.
So now, to be fair, or to be accurate rather, sure enough, we thought some of these things would be red lines, and there was no apparent Russian reaction to many of these, whether it was tanks or Patriot air defense systems or the like, and some of these other things. So you can see from a certain perspective why Macron may be saying, yeah, let's continue going. But I'm going to get your opinion on something because I think this is something you had written in your book. But first, I'm going to show you a piece from actually 2022 by Jordan Peterson, who was asked if he thought Putin actually was just bluffing or if he thought he actually would use tactical nuclear weapons. Watch this.
Do you think he will use a nuclear weapon?
If necessary, he'll use a tactical battlefield weapon.
Even if it starts World War III?
It won't. Probably.
Why? Because we wouldn't respond?
What's in it for us?
If you let him do it and get away with it, where does that end? Then you are into a hit analogy.
There's a lot. You can get yourself in a situation, no problem, where there's no good outcome. We're trying to do that right now on every front we can possibly imagine. We can easily get ourselves in a situation where it's hell this way and hell that way. That's highly probable. Naive notions that the Russians are going to lose somehow, or that we're going to win. I just don't understand. I don't understand that. Well, what do you mean we're going to win? What are we going to win here exactly?
That there's a lot of Peterson especially has many times said that there is no way that Russia would lose the war without resorting to tactical nuclear weapons. Is he right?
100%. He's correct, Colonel. We know from the intelligence standpoint that Putin is not bluffing. The Russian nuclear doctrine is very, very clear. And we conducted back in the intelligence community dozens and dozens of war games simulating a Russia-US conflict. Okay, the Russians believe, and they don't just believe it, it's actually backed up by a seminal intelligence assessment made by the general staff, that the war between the US, NATO on one side, and Russia on the other side is inevitable. Why? It's because Washington and Moscow have been on the geopolitical collision course for more than a decade, battling over control of the post-Soviet countries.
Wait! I'm sorry. Did you say that U.S. intelligence, at least some in the DIA, I guess, believe that it's inevitable that there would be a clash between the U.S. and Russia?
No, clarification. It is the Russian intelligence. The Russian general staff believes that it's inevitable. And it is for this specific reason that a very special warfighting doctrine has been developed on Putin's orders. It is called asymmetric warfare, or there are multiple names for it, or in strategy of indirect action. It's basically what Western analysts call hybrid warfare, but there's no such thing in Russian doctrine as hybrid warfare.
Do I see from your book that you had something called strategy of managed escalation? Is that what we're talking about?
Strategy of indirect action, but managed escalation is kind of part of it, and we can go into it a little bit. So, but yes, Peterson is 100% correct, and that is because for Russia and Putin, the outcome of the war in Ukraine is existential. Why is that? Ukraine is part of Russia's strategic security perimeter on which it relied for centuries. And that strategic security perimeter has shrunk from roughly 1,000 miles to 100 miles. After the collapse of the Soviet Union and after the admission of the Baltics, Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia, into NATO in 2004. So we're talking about 100 miles. That is a shorter distance than between Washington and New York. And so from the military's perspective, this risk is unacceptable, just like it would be unacceptable to us, to the United States, if Russia or China moved as close as Canada or Mexico, right? And so with the admission of Finland and Sweden into NATO, the border, between Russia, or rather the border of NATO and Russia has doubled, because Finland shares 830 miles, right? So now NATO is just so much closer to Russia. And that's why Putin is prepared to go to nuclear war. And so the question that Piers Morgan asked, well, that's going to cause, or is that going to cause Third World War? Well, the answer is no. That is specifically why this doctrine, escalate to de-escalate, was developed on Putin's orders, whereby a low yield under sub-kiloton, right, would be popped in the battlefield, not in the United States, not necessarily on Europe, unless there are certain things lead to it, right? But on the battlefield in Ukraine, in order to de-escalate. No, it's not going to start Third War, because, like, if you remember who first actually, used nuclear weapons, it was the United States in Japan. And those were about the little boy and the fat man, like around 15, kiloton, right? And even in that case, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were never really devastated to the point where they were abandoned, right? Within a couple of years, life returned there. And so Putin counts that this will simply deter. And if the United States is a rational actor, it will not escalate. Okay.
Now, can you tell us for our audience here, what does a tactical nuclear weapon look like? If it's a sub-kiloton, meaning 15 times less than Nagasaki, what would it look like on the battlefield if it was used, say, somewhere in even Western Ukraine?
Yes, very, very, very low fallout. Okay. Yeah, some targets would be destroyed. Some people will be obviously perish, but it won't be like a massive nuclear mushroom cloud. So very, very contained. And so the Russians believe that it is actually very battlefield usable. It's no longer and it has two missions. It has a deterrence, like a psychological effect, and B, it actually has some destructive, military value by destroying some military and civilian targets.
And does it have like a small nuclear mushroom cloud or something that makes it distinctive from, like, say, a big conventional bomb?
So yes, of course. But the interesting thing here, you're touching upon a very interesting subject. The Russians also would like for us to guess, like, whether it's going to be a nuclear or conventional warhead, and they are in this way kind of giving us the taste of our own medicine. What do I mean by that? So the United States uses ballistic missiles both for tactical and for strategic purposes, right? And the Russians have always been griping, how is it possible for us to differentiate that the US are not launching a NICBM like against us, and you're just using a tactical ballistic missile in the theater, whether it's like Iraq, Afghanistan, you name it.
Yeah.
And so they want us to guess. So right now we are on a very, very slippery slope, Colonel, just like as you said in the beginning, because we are escalating. Even though a lot of the people here say that, oh, Putin is a blowhard, he's not going to do that. And that again goes back to those cultural differences that we spoke in the very beginning. It's because the United States has not experienced war, on its soil since, the Civil War, right?
War of 1812.
And
Yeah, well,
so
yes, Civil War, right?
there's a presupposition that nothing terrible can happen. And for the Russians, it's the other way around. They expected. And I
Something to
heard
happen.
these sorts of explanations and excuses back in the DIA and from the Obama administrations when we were briefing them. This is what Putin's doctrine is. This is what his plan is. We laid it out. And then eventually I wrote a book about it at the unclassified level. It was exasperating that nobody wanted to listen. There was always an excuse that no, Putin is not going to do. He's just a blowhard, and like people don't want to believe what Putin's said he was going to do, and it was not a secret. And
Okay,
so
well,
he said it
seeming to completely validate what you just said, a little known interview on CNN not long ago talked about something that happened in 2022 that for some reason didn't get a lot of news here, either at the time or subsequent. But check out Jim Sciutto here talking about how we almost saw a tactical nuke in the fall of 2022.
There was one more piece to this, and this made it even far more serious, is that the U.S. received intelligence, communications among Russian military officers discussing that very possibility of a use of nuclear weapons. And this then led U.S. officials to go on really an international full-court press to prevent this from happening. Direct contact with Russian officials, getting allies on board as well, but interestingly, enlisting the help of India and China. It has always been the case that the use of particularly a tactical nuclear weapon, battlefield nuclear weapon, of course, it's not going to destroy a city, but still devastating on the battlefield, is that it's lower on their escalation ladder than it is on the U.S. escalation ladder, and could be in response to a conventional threat, including the loss of Russian territory. And of course, this is Ukrainian territory, but Russia had claimed it was their own.
So now, if there was a risk of escalation to the tactical nuclear level, when Russia had a setback in Kherson and in Kharkiv, what does anybody think that Russia would do if it was a serious issue, like they were being forced out of some of the territories, the 4 territories that they have annexed, or Crimea for that level? It seems like it would be a virtual certainty that he would do so.
Exactly. Completely agree with you 100%. But the thing is also, Colonel, is that the U.S. intelligence knows this. And President Biden has been briefed on that. And that is exactly why he admitted to his donors a few months ago that the possibility of a nuclear Armageddon is real because of what Putin thinks. So what concerns me at this point is that because President Biden is cognitively and physically impaired, it is people who are around him that are making decisions. And it seems to me that those people are completely disregarding all intelligence indications and warning of the escalation. And clearly the escalation right now is ongoing, because remember the context. It's not just the Russia-Ukraine, right? The context of what is happening in the world right now. We are having one of the largest military drill, NATO, steadfast defender, right? Since Cold War, the biggest one, 90,000 troops, right? Russia, China, and Iran, on the other hand, are also having their own drills at the same time. And the risk of unintentional escalation is extremely high right now. Why is that? It goes back again into that presupposition of the worst case scenario and the belief that the war between Russia and the United States is inevitable. So everything that we do, everything that NATO does, everything that Macron says, everything that President Biden says,
It feeds right into it.
is filling the what we call the composite, and the composite of the adversary and the composite of the threat environment. And if I could just take a few seconds to describe how Russians do their threat assessments, because it's very, very important. It's completely different how we do our threat assessment. They do it algorithmically, okay? They use a special software, and it's very similar to what the U.S. Insurance industries, car industries, like health insurance. No,
Wouldn't have expected that.
Hear me out. Hear me
Yeah.
out. A person like a young male, right, 20 years old, driving a red Mustang would be paying much higher insurance than an older lady driving a Buick. Why is that? You tell me, Colonel. Because of the risk, right?
Right.
And so the Russians, they have observed what the United States has been doing in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Kosovo. And they have concluded that Russia is next on the regime change, agenda for the US. And so everything that right now, they are assessing our weapons programs. They are assessing what we're doing from the intelligence standpoint, military exercises, everything that our leaders say, they throw it into the software, and with algorithmically, it produces, threat level is this high. We're this close to, a conventional, direct kinetic war, or we're this close to nuclear war, right? And so it's completely different with what we do. And so every time President Biden says things like, Putin is a killer, he's a crazy SOB, or Macron says we cannot Russia win, it goes into that algorithm. You understand?
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
at some point, things take over.
Yeah.
Right? In the decision making, software spits out a recommendation to Putin. Okay, you got to do this because we're expecting the United States to start, an exit. You understand? It's similar to the perimeter. If you are familiar with the dead hand, the nuclear the nuclear basically protection system, the dead hand, where nukes can be launched even as Putin, is dead. Let's say Russia is decapitated and there's no national command authority, right? So they can still launch nukes. It's this kind of similar. And the fact that the Washington so-called experts, right, who call for, to provide more weaponry to Ukraine, give them this system, that system, they completely oblivious. It's really irresponsible, and this is dangerous. And the American people have no idea how close we are right now to what you're talking about.
And on that point, I want to ask you something, because one other curious parts of Putin's comments day before yesterday, where he said something here that to most Western ears, including mine, was a bit puzzling. And I wonder if you can tell us maybe what was meant behind this. This is one of the points where Putin seemed to be kind of agitated a little bit more. And I wonder if you can kind of tell us what you think he's meaning when he says this about some sort of ball of vampires.
In the Western elites, there is a strong desire to freeze the current unfair state of things in international affairs. For centuries, they've been stuffing their stomachs with human flesh, and they've been stuffing their pockets with money, but they must realize that this ball of vampires is about to end.
What do you make of that? This ball of vampires and toes with flesh. What is he referring to there?
Okay, well, so everything that Putin says it has two target audiences, right? It has the domestic audience, the Russian audience, and the international audiences, both Western and Eastern. So a lot of it has to do with ratcheting up the portrayal of the Western threat, right? The second thing, so that the Russians continue to galvanize their support of Putin. But the other thing is this: Putin is acutely aware of the divisions within the Western societies and the polarization that's going on right now between the elites and between the so-called deplorables, right? The common folk, the blue collar folk, the MAGA people, and so he is trying to even ratchet up that narrative so that MAGA people, blue collar deplorables, support Putin, okay? And they undermine support for President Biden and Washington elites in general. But also, another meaning here in his talk is that Russia and China and Iran right now, they are all bonding together. And it's basically President Biden's idiotic, I would say, pardon my word, policies that pushed all of these adversaries together. You know, the sanction policy that never worked. It wasn't supposed to work because Putin sanction-proofed his economy back in 2015, because Putin is actually not an idiot. He's a highly intelligent person. Even though he's a brutal dictator, he's intelligent. He has a PhD in economics in addition to his legal profession. And so what Putin means is the dollar empire. And why is the United States so successful? It's the strength of our dollar that the entire world relies on. And now Biden's policies have weaponized the dollar against the other countries. And so Russia, China, Iran, and the BRICS group are now going to start de-dollarizing their economies. And that's what Putin means, that our people have been stuffing, exploiting people. It's all the Marxist talks right now, but there is some truth to that, right? But he wants to appeal to our population as well.
We actually had on our show not long ago Ambassador Chaz Freeman, who came to this very similar conclusion.
We've got two wars. Ukraine, which is going very, very badly in terms of what we intended and strove to achieve. This war in Gaza is an absolute disaster for us strategically. It is undermining our position globally to a horrendous degree. And we have pushed the Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians all together. North Korea has taken advantage of this. We are creating an axis of evil by our own evil.
It's hard to put any better of a coda on than what he just said there, because this is really reinforcing what you just said, that this is our own policies are pushing these folks together, when before all this started, they were almost like stovepipes. They had marginal connections, but they were not loose. But now that it's like physically providing weapons, like from North Korea and Iran into Russia, and it's unknown just, how far China is willing to go on all this, at least at the moment.
And think about this also, Colonel Davis. So Iranian proxies are now effectively waging low-grade war, right? In the Suez Canal, they're trying to choke off, the transportation of goods, harassing people. And imagine if Russia shares its nuclear know-how with Iran. Iran is already this close to being able to operationalize its nuclear capability. And what if Russia, China, share their space and counter space capabilities, right? Space warfare is another thing that I describe, in my book. That is really, really at the top of Putin's agenda. And that is just below, on the escalation ladder, just below the nuclear war. So, and the people who are making decisions right now within the Biden administration, it doesn't appear to me that they are, I don't know whether they're intelligent enough or whether they are lacking strategic thinking type, capabilities that they can assess, that they could look at this holistically. It seems like they're kind of looking at it in a very myopic way, and they can't really connect the dots together. They somehow maniacally has focused on Ukraine, and it's really interesting to me. Like I'm puzzled. I'm wondering what it is with Ukraine that makes them just so fanatically determined to continue depleting our own weapons arsenal and depleting our own, U.S. Taxpayers' purses to pump in that weaponry to Ukraine for this unwinnable war. That is puzzling to me.
Now, and I want to pivot off of that right there, because that's I think when we're going to circle back here to the possibility of the risk of a nuclear escalation here, which is what I've been arguing we should avoid from the outset. One of the absolute key ingredients into whether something escalates beyond that or not is the trust that the leaders have behind closed doors. Now, I guess during the Clinton administration, apparently, according to Clinton in a 2013 clip I'm about to show you, there was some level of trust behind closed doors between the U.S. president and Vladimir Putin. Watch this.
Mr. Putin he's very smart.
Well, you know him better than most people.
Yeah, I do.
What was he like behind closed doors, away from, the sort of the public utterances?
Smart and remarkably, we had a really good, blunt relationship.
How blunt?
Brutally blunt.
Ever fisticuffs?
No, but I think the right strategy most of the time is, but it's frustrating to people in your line of work. You should be brutally honest with people in private. And then if you want them to help you, try to avoid embarrassing them in public.
Right. Did Putin ever renege on a personal agreement he made to you?
He did not.
So behind closed doors, he could be trusted?
He kept his word in all the deals we made.
So here's the president of the United States, former president, saying that at least to him, behind closed doors, Putin never said anything he didn't do later on. So he actually meant what he said. There was some level of trust. But mirroring what you just said here a second ago, Doug McGregor came on our show the other day and said that basically we have destroyed that level of trust. Watch this. If the Russians see the Western nations doing this, putting all this money in killing their troops, I mean, at some point they're going to say it's stupid for us not to get ready for that outcome. And of course, then you have this mutually building fear of each other. And that's what leads to a lot of wars. And so we're going down a path right now that our foolish actions here could lead us into catastrophe.
No, I think so. But I also think Mr. Putin is a rational man. He's never wanted any of this. He really wants to get back to some sort of state of normalcy with the West and do business. But as you say, he has to respond to what he sees develop. Right now, we have Americans moving in to create bases in northern Finland and Sweden. We've destroyed decades of trust and mutual confidence, replaced all of it with mutual suspicion, fear, and distrust.
And if anybody had any doubts of what Putin's thinking today, he eliminated that when he said this.
Americans in the 1990s, they coined medals for the victory in the Cold War. And since then, all these decades, they were decades of great lies. How can we expect them to go and sign an honest treaty, an honest agreement with us that they will carry out, that they will implement with any guarantees for us? Do you really believe that? I don't trust anyone. We need guarantees. And these guarantees must be in writing, and they must be the guarantees that will make us happy, that we will trust. That's what we are saying. I think maybe it's a little bit premature to say what these guarantees could look like, but we are not going to believe some empty promises anymore.
So the question, Rebekah, is this. If the trust has been shattered like that, is there anything that we could do or say that would make him think that his security is not threatened? And maybe a more poignant question, do you think it's already to the point to where it's inevitable that Russia is going to escalate to tactical nuclear weapons at some point to establish a firm, no, this is how far you can go and no further?
Well, I think it depends on whether we trip that wire, right? The red line. Crimea is absolutely a red line, and right now I think there's talk among some Western analysts that NATO allies are going to help Ukraine retake Crimea. When in that situation, it's an almost certainty that Putin is going to use tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield. Trust is shattered absolutely right now. There's nothing that we can say to make Putin believe, because a lot, just like Colonel McGregor just said, a lot of action has taken place. The absorption of 2 additional countries into NATO, and the proximity now between NATO and Russia. So I think it's going to take, and the distrust, of President Biden and the assessment, the Russian intelligence services have made the assessment that President Biden is just, cognitively impaired, cannot be trusted. And the fact that he keeps calling, Putin, whether it's like killer or this man cannot remain in power or crazy SOB, Putin interprets it as Biden's inability to stay calm, that Putin can get to him. And so Putin is actually feeling pretty confident with Biden being in power. But it's going to take the next leader who's more rational, right? And right now we have former President Trump as being the top candidate, right? Virtually the nominee. And interestingly, Putin did not do anything, that would be perceived as crazy by Western analysts on Trump's watch. And there's a reason for that. I actually wrote in an analytic piece about a year ago in the Federalist titled Donald Trump is the only U.S. President that Putin fears, where I articulated 5 reasons why Putin, how Trump put the fear of God into Putin and why Putin was pretty much tamed. And I think it's going to take somebody like Trump, President Trump, to tame Putin. And Trump never called Putin, anything derogatory, but he pursued the most robust anti-Russia policy since Ronald Reagan. And again, I describe it in that piece. And Trump is not rattled. He's able to deal with Putin on a transactional basis, just like former President Clinton that we just saw. They had this trust because Clinton dealt with him as an equal, right? He was diplomatic, just like a real leader, right? President Biden behaves like he's in a kindergarten, right? He calls names, it's just not serious. But only a serious person who means business can deal with Putin. Yes, it is possible, but not with the current administration.
So let me ask you this as we close here: what needs to happen to prevent any undesired escalation into nuclear weapons right now, especially with Macron's very fiery comments here and the possibility that they could send troops? If France or any other Western power, and Poland's actually toyed with some of this in the last couple of days as well, sends troops into any part of Ukraine, into the Western part to stabilize whatever, no matter what the name is, does that raise the possibility that Russia would engage those troops, which Putin said he would? He would consider any troops in Ukraine to be combatants, and he would treat them as such. Could that escalate the war?
Yes, because if a NATO country, any NATO country, whether it's any of the Baltics, Poland, any, deploys forces into the theater, Putin interprets it that it's the entire NATO's, right? It's the Article 5, right? So if Putin destroys those troops, then we are in a direct kinetic war, basically. And so the entire NATO can come to those forces' defense. So, and Putin has a preemptive doctrine, Okay, so he's not going to wait until the NATO forces overwhelm Russia, because NATO enjoys is overwhelming conventional superiority, conventional being the key word, over Russia. And it's exactly why Russia developed that nuanced and sophisticated nuclear doctrine, because they cannot simply rely on their conventional capabilities. And so there's a concept that is called strategic initiative in the Russian warfighting doctrine, and that is only achieved by preemption. Right? If they wait too long, then it's lost. And the tactical nuclear capability has that mission to achieve that preemption, to achieve that strategic initiative, and ideally for the Russians to deter what they perceive as invading force. Because remember, as one of your previous guests said, whether it's Peterson or somebody or Morgan, because the Russians believe Ukraine is part of Russia, in their mind, NATO would be attacking Russia. And that's what triggers that nuclear doctrine.
Yeah. And fortunately, we have like Chancellor Scholz. We've got Viktor Orban, who are NATO members and definitely not on board with going to war with Russia, emphatically so. Let's hope that saner voices can prevail and this can remain an academic discussion and we don't ever have to view it on the battlefield. But thanks ever so much for coming on today, Rebekah. And certainly we invite you to check out her book, the Putin's Playbook, and also her newsletter for independent thinkers, Cut to the News. You can Google that online and find that too. And we encourage you to go check that out to get more about what Rebekah has to say. So thank you very much for coming on today. And we thank you for joining with us. We remain unintimidated and uncompromised to bring you all the news that you need. And folks, you are not going to want to miss this. Later on today at 2:00, we have Ambassador Chaz Freeman back on to talk about, is this Cold War 2.0 as NATO faces off with Putin? Let's hope that it doesn't go nuclear. And I guess in this case, maybe a best case scenario is going to be hoping that it goes to a Cold War and not a hot war. But you're not going to want to miss Ambassador Freeman this afternoon. Thanks very much. And we will see you later today on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.